I'm Mark Vlossak. I'm the founder and winemaker of St. Innocent Winery, which is just north of Salem in the Willamette Hills of Oregon's Willamette Valley. Well, I think it's a relatively new region that does something that not very many places in the world can do, which is to provide Pinot Noir with a climate that can ripen Pinot Noir, but just barely. And you get more distinct flavors in a region that's right on the edge of its ability to ripen fruit, because most of the flavor that develops in any kind of grape variety is really developed in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And if there's a lot of heat and a lot of sun during that ripening phase, you get a lot of sugar and you don't get much acid, but you don't get a lot of flavor. Where if it's relatively cool and that ripening period takes place in moderate temperatures, essentially at the end of a growing season in the particular region, then what you get is a lot more flavor development, maintaining the acidity because it's not so hot. Heat burns up acid, and also you have more moderate alcohols, because the other thing that heat does is the plant makes a lot of sugar when it's really hot and sunny. So the ideal place is to get, especially with Pinot Noir, which is essentially a grape that is rooted in its balance between the tannins that it has from the skins and the acidity, which adds a backbone and food compatibility. What you really want in Pinot Noir is to develop in a place where you maintain a good acidity into the grapes all the way through harvest, but get a lot of distinct flavors. And it's those distinct flavors beyond just the fruit that really gives you the characteristics of terroir. In a really hot place, in a really hot vintage, the grapes ripen very quickly, and they just don't have the time to develop the detailed flavors that we're looking for in what we consider to be really great Pinot Noir. Oregon happens to have one of the coolest microclimates in the United States. It's essentially 500 miles north of the North Coast region in California. And so we are relatively cool. Our growing season is relatively short, but we're blessed with relatively warm summers that are quite dry, which means a very healthy place to grow the grapevine itself, which provides all the energy to get the grapes right. But then, because we're also far north, in the fall the day length drops off. The temperatures cool down. And yet it stays sunny with nice cool nights. Cool nights retain acidity in the wine. The sun allows the skins to develop nicely, and all those tannins and all those phenolic substances, all the color substances that you want in a ripe red grape. And also develops the nuances of flavor. And we just have, hopefully, in most years, enough time to do that. Well, essentially in Oregon, it was regional originally. So there was the Willamette Valley, there is the Rogue Valley, the Umpqua Valley, the Applegate Valley, and then the Columbia Gorge area. And essentially these are geographically disparate places that have very different climates. The Willamette Valley was one of the larger and was certainly the home for more wineries than any of the other AVAs. The number of wineries and winemakers in the Willamette Valley thought that having it just as a homogeneous place, the Willamette Valley, which is 120 miles tall and 50 miles wide, that there were more nuances to the valley than that. There were different kinds of soils, there were different hillsides located, especially within the northern half of the valley, that people thought actually made wines that were distinctly different. And of course, one of the ideas of terroir is if the wines are different and there is a regional identity, then you can create a name for that terroir. In Burgundy, it centers around villages. So you have Vosne Romanée, you have Pommard, you have Nuits Saint-Georges. These are villages that aren't very far apart geographically, and they're essentially on a long set of southeast-facing slopes where the Eau-Côte de Nuits drops down into the valley below. And as the hill breaks along this long, long slope, you have these villages. And essentially what the Burgundians figured out was that those villages really created different styles of wine. The Pinot Noir took on characteristics, even though from an airplane, the thing looked like a big long hillside. But when you really got down to the specifics of growing grapes, you found that there was an identity within these different villages. And so they created the appellations. and that's reflected in the appellation control system. In the United States, we have an appellation system, the American viticultural areas, and what these winemakers felt that it would be advantageous for Oregon in the Willamette Valley to differentiate subregions of the valley into their own AVAs. 6 were proposed over a period of 5 or 6 years. They were all approved. They start from the southernmost AVA, which is where we are, the Willamette Hills, which is essentially a 17-mile strip of hills, kind of shaped like a kidney, so it's kind of tucked in the center. It's kind of 2 bulges of the hills. Up to the north and west of us is the Mcminnville Appalachian, which essentially is the northern boundary of the opening of the Van Duzer corridor into the Willamette Valley. The Van Duzer corridor is important because it is essentially the route where cold air from the ocean enters the valley in the evening. And that cold air then has a really profound effect on retaining acidity in the wines and really making it possible to make Pinot Noirs with the kind of acid backbone that you look to in Burgundy and we look to here in Oregon. That acid is a really important part of the structure and the food compatibility of the wine. Then if you go north from the Mcminnville AVA, which is basically entirely west and a little bit north of Mcminnville, if you go north, there is a horseshoe shape, like an upside-down horseshoe, called the Yamhill-Carlton District, which essentially connects the Mcminnville on the west side with the Dundee Hills, more centrally located in the valley. And it's essentially a horseshoe around that connects those two, Yamhill-Carlton District. Then a little bit farther north and east of the Yamhill-Carlton District is a long mountain range that basically runs from northwest to southeast called the Chehalem Mountains. That's its own AVA, and then the western southern corner of that AVA has been separated, and that's called Ribbon Ridge. And it appears that the soils and the growing conditions are distinctly different in that small part of the Chehalem Mountains, so they separated it out and called it the Ribbon Ridge AVA. So we have 6 sub-appellations in the Willamette Valley, mostly very close to each other, connected in some way. The only place that's really separated is the Willamette Hills, because there's essentially a valley floor to the north, east, and west that separates the Willamette Hills from the other 5 that are more kind of uniformly connected up north. We all know that if you go in Burgundy or in California or in Oregon and you take a vineyard and then you go 300 yards or 300 meters away, that the wines can be very different in a really short period of space. And my idea was to try to understand how that period of space actually changes the wine. So within an AVA or between AVAs, these 4 factors I think have a really strong effect on identity, on the terroir specificity. And so they're essentially the soil type, which is essentially in Oregon we have several different soil types, but 2 that are dominant. One is volcanic soils, which are relatively young in the last volcanic era, measured in tens of thousands of years. And these are essentially eroded high iron clays with volcanic origin. Then the second major soil type in the valley are very much older sedimentary soils, soils that were essentially under the ocean, and these are aged in tens of millions, not tens of thousands, but tens of millions of years old. And these essentially are soils that created from the sedimentary deposits in the oceans. And then though that essentially area that was under the ocean originally millions of years ago off the Oregon coast, that area under the water was pushed up and became dry land. And so those soils are derived primarily from what used to be ancient ocean floors, much like Chablis and Burgundy were ocean floor soils. These are sedimentary soils that got pushed up out of the ancient oceans. This is more recent than what you'd find in Chablis, which is measured in hundreds of millions of years, but still quite old. These ocean floor soils were pushed up, folded into the Coast Range and into the valley. And these soils tend, compared to the clay soils, they tend to be less nutrient rich, and they have less water holding capacity, so they're droughtier. So the soil then will affect what the vine eats and what it drinks in a very, very basic way. So the soils that are volcanic in origin have more food and more water. And the soils that are sedimentary in origin have less. That's the basic factor. But then it gets a little more complicated, because if you have a soil that's very rich, but you don't have very much of it, maybe it's only 12 or 18 inches deep, the vine, although it sees the food in the top, Oregon is a very dry place. It doesn't rain very much in the summer. In fact, we haven't had any rain in this vintage. Now we're in the middle of August. We haven't had any rain since the 22nd of June. And that's not a drought for us, that's just normal. It doesn't rain much in the summer here. So the soils that are very thin, even if they're relatively rich and can hold water, those soils dry out, and the vine starts to lose its water source and starts to stress a little bit and have a more difficulty in doing its job of growing grapes and growing leaves and the canopy, things it has to do. In the Dundee Hills, for example, the soils, the volcanic soils, are very, very deep, 6 to 10 feet deep. And in the Dundee Hills, that vine is not going to run out of water. It's not going to run out of food. It can send its roots 10, 20 feet deep. It can explore all of those deep sediments down there, all of those clays, and essentially find the food it needs. And it can continue to grow and be reasonably happy throughout the growing season. Again, in the Willamette Hills here, we have very similar soils, but they're much thinner, and they tend to drought out. So that's the second factor. The third factor has to do with the environment. And essentially, we have this wind that blows off the coast in the evening called the Van Duzer Corridor, through what's called the Van Duzer Corridor. And the cold wind cools the vine and shuts the vine down. Now, the basis for acidity in a wine is essentially related to nighttime temperatures. If the environment gets dark and it's warm, the vine continues to be metabolically active. It needs food. And the vine thinks that the sugars that it's made from photosynthesis during the day are too valuable to use as a food source at night. So the vine eats acidity. That's what it uses for food. However, if the temperature drops very rapidly as the sun sets to below 60 degrees, the vine goes to sleep. It stops eating acid. So essentially, this thing you think, well, who cares what happens at night? But all of a sudden, what happens at night is very important for the structure of wine, because remember, Pinot Noir is not just about tannins. Cabernet, Merlot is very much about its tannin structure, not so much about its acidity. But Pinot Noir doesn't stick in the wine as many tannins as you would find in Cabernet. The grape has a lot of tannins in the skin, but they don't stay in the wine. A certain amount of them suspends itself or essentially incorporates itself into the finished wine, but not nearly the level that you would have in Cabernet. So the structure of Pinot Noir is inherently different than you would see with Cab, Merlot, and other red varietals, other warmer red varietals. Essentially, the Pinot Noir structure is a balance between the amount of tannin and the amount of acid. So if you change the environment to give the wine essentially more acidity, in other words, a place that cools rapidly at night, the vine doesn't burn up the acid, you get into harvest, and there's more acidity in the wine, in the juice, in the grapes, and then into the wine. You have a wine with an inherently different structure than if you have a place that's warm at night. In Oregon, the cold weather doesn't just uniformly show up in the valley. The cold winds come off the ocean, through the Van Duzer Corridor, which is the only break in a 3,000-foot set of mountains that separates the Willamette Valley from the ocean. The mountains are all the way along the coast are about 3,000 feet. Only at the Van Duzer Corridor does it drop down to 600 feet. And the winds, they're not stupid, that's where they go. And so the winds that come through the Van Duzer really blow almost like a banshee as the sun sets. And as the closer you are to the mouth of the Van Duzer, the more rapidly the temperature drops. And the farther away, the more hot air that's accumulated in the valley has to cool down. And it doesn't cool down rapidly. It cools down slowly because there's a lot of hot air out here. Not just from politicians, but they're just hot air in the middle of the valley. And so the winds have to mix with the hot air and it cools down more and more slowly. So the area very, very close, the Willamette Hills and the Mcminnville Appalachian, which are very close to the mouth of the Van Duzer, cool more rapidly. The wines have a little more acidity. They tend to have a little more spice in them. That's the other flavor component that seems to go along with a little more acidity. The area of the Chehalem Mountains and the Dundee Hills are the farthest AVAs in the Willamette Valley away from the mouth of the Van Duzer. More hot air to cool down. The winds are still blowing, but the temperatures don't descend as rapidly. And so those wines have a little bit lower acidity. They're a little softer. The spice component is not as intense in those wines. It's more of a nuance rather than a signature component in those AVAs. And so you often have more perfumey, more floral components in grapes farther away from the mouth of the Van Duzer. The last component is how hot is it in the day. And that, like in California and anywhere, the warmer it is in the day, the more sun and the more heat is in the environment of the skin of the grape. And if the grape just is inherently warmer and sunnier, it creates more tannins in it. So most of the Oregon AVAs are interspersed or interconnected sets of hills. So if you look around you, you see a hill there, hills all around you. And so those are not inherently hot places. The hills are cooler. You go up in the hill, it gets cooler. However, there are vineyards in the Willamette Valley that are essentially on a large hillside with very flat, large expanse of farmland below it. And those vineyards uniquely have more heat that the vine experiences during the day. And generally in those sites, the wines have more tannin in them because the grape has a chance to ripen its skin and develop more tannins actually in the skin because of that essentially extra heat. And so in those particular vineyards, you see bigger tannins, more tannin structure. And you'll see this also in a long set of hills. The lower sections of the hill will have more heat than way up at the top. And so you have more of this kind of intense tannin structure. And the Mcminnville AVA, especially on the southern edges of that AVA, is essentially a large hill, a set of hills that essentially backs up to the coast range of mountains, but with a very flat, hot valley. More than 100 square miles of flat, hot farmland that radiates heat up in the day. And so the Mcminnville AVA, comparatively, being closer to the Van Duzer, is very warm in the daytime, and with its proximity to the Van Duzer, suddenly very cold at night. And what people have found is that these wines have more intense structure, more dark flavors, more intense spiciness. Often people describe almost a kind of coffee or cocoa overtones into these wines. It's not because the winemakers say, oh, I want to make a different wine. It's because the heat of the day combined with a very sudden, huge temperature drop in the evening creates just a different profile of tannin in the skin. When you make wine from grapes that are grown in that AVA, the wine is going to reflect that very different structure, more acidity and more tannin, more power. Yeah, it's a really good question. And it was fundamentally interesting to the French, actually, because in France, they don't ever talk about, essentially finding terroir, because it's all laid out on a map. In Oregon, the winemakers all think about finding terroir. Like, what vineyard inspires you? What vineyard do you want to work with? Because it isn't laid out on a map. There isn't a appellation control that says this is Grand Cru, this is Premier Cru, this is Vlossak. That doesn't exist here. So essentially, winemakers become inspired. And I don't know why exactly, but we all do. We all are inspired. We go to a place and we just think, oh, that sings my tune. I like that song. I like what I hear. I like what I see. I like what I taste. And then we're drawn to these terroirs for different reasons, sometimes because they're so different from something we already have, we're already familiar with. And so we go to these different regions. So if you look at the paradigm that I constructed of soil type, soil depth, how hot is it in the day and how cold is it at night, essentially that means that primarily as you work east and west in the valley, not so much north and south, but east and west, the wine profile changes dramatically. So the Mcminnville AVA will have the darkest fruited, most savory spiced, most structured, but also with the most acidity in the wines. These are essentially like winter, sit by the fireplace, have beef stew kind of wines, or cassoulet. They're rustic, they're wild, they're intense. They're not about finesse. They're about that kind of stuff. And as you go farther, the farthest east, essentially the Dundee Hills, you have the wines that are the prettiest, the most seductive, the round, the red fruited. They smell fantastic. They're charming in their own right. And so what you essentially end up is with personalities. As you move north and south, there are changes. Essentially, the Willamette Hills is directly below the Amil Carlton district. And I actually have the vineyard way up in the Amil Carlton district and all the way through the Willamette Hills. I find that the structure isn't so much that the basic structure is different, but that within their personality, they have different things to share. So up north, like at Shea, I find that Shea has all these floral components, especially darker floral components. It has all these nuances of distinctly different flavors, especially a blend of red and black fruit in almost a unique way that there's like, you see lots of different things going on in a vineyard like Shea. It's probably my most detailed of all the vineyards I work with. As I come into the Willamette Hills, I still have red and black fruits, but they're more frank. They're more like, here's what I am. Do you like it? Great. You don't like it? Great. I can't be anything else. This is what I am. And so there's a kind of frank honesty that I find in the Willamette Hills. Do I like Shea? I love Shea. It ages ridiculously long. It's got all kinds of details. When I want, a wine that reminds me of the best of Burgundy, which is all about detail and ageability, it's Pinot Organ, that translates to Shea for me. But if I want a wine to go with a beautiful piece of salmon, that's a very precise set of flavors. There's nothing like vineyards in the Willamette Hills. I love these wines with like a piece of salmon or a duck breast because they're very precise, they're very defined flavors. And the wines here tend to have that kind of precision and definition. They tend to have more spice qualities because of the Van Duzer influence. And they tend to be a little bit more rustic down here. Again, the Van Duzer, the cooling at night, tends to add a little edginess to them. And so the personalities of these different regions talk to me. And I become enamored with these vineyards with all these different profiles, probably because they're different. And it's that difference. It's like, do you want all your friends to be exactly the same? I don't. I have some friends that are charming and some friends that are kind of irritating, but they're all fun to be around at various points. And when I think about food, I don't just eat grilled salmon or cassoulet, but I eat all different kinds of things. And I think about my wines many times in terms of, well, is this a duck breast wine, or is this a cassoulet wine, or is it a grilled salmon wine? Is it a Boeuf Bourguignon wine? Is it a lamb shank wine? And for me, I have wine that goes really well with all those things. They're not all the same wine. But in a way, then my friends at the dinner table, I can pair the food and the wine, and they get along, and they have fun together. And to me, that's how I think about wine. It's part of a meal. Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, it's a great life. It allows me to both be creative, to be artistic, and to be a craftsman. It's a great project for my life. There's lots of science, but great wines are not made in a laboratory. There are great visionary things. You think about the way you want a wine, you get inspired by a piece of terroir, and you have this idea of what you're going to create. And then there is the craft, putting wine in a barrel, taking care of your barrels, bottling wine, bottling it properly. It's a craft, and essentially each of these components, the art, the craft, the science, kind of stimulates different parts of me. And I love the fact that I get to do all of those things and still make a product that sings to my soul, that sings to my guts, that sings to my heart. And it's wonderful to be able to make wine. I love it.